Assalamu alaikum ji. Welcome to the PIDE webinar. I think we shall begin now. This is our fourth or fifth webinar on central bank independence. The subject is extremely important, little debated, little understood. People are going on fatwas and beliefs and really not investigating or talking about the subject. तो हमारी कोशिश ये है कि हर सब्जेक्ट पे पीआईडी का मैंडेट ये होना चाहिए और हमारी कोशिश होनी चाहिए हर सब्जेक्ट पे हम जरा बारीकी से और गहराई से देखें और समझने की कोशिश करें. तो वी बीन ट्राइंग टू डू दिस इन दीज वेबिनार्स. तो अभी तक बहुत सारे सवाल खुले हैं. फॉर एग्जांपल अशरफ जंजुआ साहब से शुरू करते हैं. अशरफ जंजुआ साहब हमारे साथ हैं. अशरफ जंजुआ साहब को इंट्रोड्यूस पहले करा दूं. फॉर्मर डिप्टी गवर्नर ऑफ द सेंट्रल बैंक या IMF भी रहे हुए. लॉन्ग इलस्ट्रियस करियर, माशाल्लाह, वन ऑफ अ वेल नोन मैक्रो इकोनॉमिस्ट, मॉनेटरी इकोनॉमिस्ट. इनके साथ हैं हमजा अली मलिक, also long-term central bank employee, but young man now has left, finally seen sense and left the country and gone to UN. तो ये भी सही बात है. अब क्या करें, इस मुल्क में जगह नहीं होती तो बच्चे भाग जाते हैं. दूसरे हैं डॉक्टर अहमद जमील पीरज़ादा, जो असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर हैं यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ब्रिस्टल में. ये भी माशाल्लाह यहाँ प्लानिंग कमीशन में रहे हैं, बट भाग गए मुल्क से, क्योंकि ये मुल्क तो चाहता ही है कि सब भाग जाएं यहाँ अच्छे लोग. तो ये भी अपनी जगह बात सही है. तो अशरफ जंजुआ साहब, मैं ज़्यादा टाइम नहीं लूँगा, मैं सीधा आपके पास आऊँगा कि ये बताइए, याकूब साहब से हमारी बात हुई थी, आपके भी पुराने दोस्त हैं, आपके साथ बड़ा उनका लंबा टाइम गुजरा है. याकूब साहब तो कह रहे हैं कि इस लॉ की कोई ज़रूरत नहीं है. वी डोंट नीड अ न्यू लॉ, देयर इज़ इनफ इंडिपेंडेंस इन द ओल्ड लॉ, एंड बस बिसाइड दिस लॉ में काफ़ी चीज़ें अनक्लियर हैं. मैं उस डिटेल में नहीं जाता, बिकॉज मेरा ख्याल आप बेहतर एक्सप्लेन कर सकेंगे. तो जनाब जंजुआ साहब, पहले आप ज़रा शुरू करें. लेट्स स्टार्ट देयर.
अशरफ साहब, सर काइंडली अपना माइक अनम्यूट कर लें. सर
माइक अनम्यूट कर लें अशरफ साहब, नीचे लेफ्ट कॉर्नर में. अशरफ साहब माइक अनम्यूट करें. चले, इस पे लिंक पे क्लिक कर दें. मैंने आपको भेजी ना लिंक, इस पे क्लिक कर दें.
जी
हाँ जी, आप बोलिए जी.
तो जनाब, ये बात उर्दू में होगी या अंग्रेजी में, या
मिक्स? ठीक है, मिक्स ठीक है.
तो बात ये है जी कि स्टेट बैंक के एक्ट में इतनी लचक मौजूद है कि उसके तहत अगर गवर्नर कोई फैसला लेना चाहे तो वो यकीनन फैसला ले सकता है, और एंड ही इज नॉट अकाउंटेबल टू एनीबॉडी. जो स्टेट बैंक एक्ट का सेक्शन 9A है, उसको अगर आप गौर से पढ़ें तो स्टेट बैंक के एक्ट में इतनी वुसअत मौजूद है, इतनी स्कोप है कि द गवर्नर स्टेट बैंक कैन. अब देखिए, हमने 20 साल तक क्रेडिट बजटिंग से मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी चलाई. अब क्रेडिट बजटिंग एक टोटली नई चीज है. वो पॉलिसी भी थी और एंकर भी थे, सब कुछ था, बट नोबडी ऑब्जेक्टेड टू दैट. और तो मेरा ख्याल है जी कि याकूब साहब बिल्कुल वजह कहते हैं. अब बात यह है जी कि मरकजी बैंक में दो चीजों का होना बहुत जरूरी है. एक तो यह है कि गवर्नर जो है वो क्वालिफाइड हो, कैरेक्टर वाला आदमी हो, रिस्क लेने वाला आदमी हो, और दूसरा ये है कि उसके पास रिसर्च और पॉलिसी डिपार्टमेंट्स ऐसे हों जो उसको हर वक्त पॉलिसी एनालिसिस, पॉलिसी ऑप्शंस और उनके पॉसिबल रिएक्शंस जो है बताते रहें, ताकि गवर्नर उन सब ऑप्शंस को सामने रख के फैसला करे. तो मेरे नजदीक इसमें किसी तब्दीली की जरूरत नहीं है. तो इसलिए मैं याकूब साहब से कुल्ली तौर पर मुतफिक हूँ. मेरा अपना व्यू भी यही है, अगर याकूब साहब ये ना भी कहें तो भी. शुक्रिया जी.
जी, thank you very much. Hamza Saab, we have been on a webinar before and we have some disagreements, but that's besides the point. ये मुझे बताइए प्लीज कि स्टेट बैंक की लॉ में आपके ख्याल में इसकी क्यों इतनी शदीद ज़रूरत है कि हुकूमत इस पर पूरी अपनी पॉलिटिकल दाव लगा दे, और इससे हमें आम सिटीजन को क्या फ़र्क पड़ेगा?
देखिए, एक तो सिंपल सी जो, थैंक यू वेरी मच फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल अगेन फॉर दिस इज आई थिंक नंबर 4 in the series, so great initiative on a very important subject, so keep it up. Thanks to PIDE. I think Ahmed and I were in the same panel, so there will be some repetitions of points, but let's pick up the conversation jahan Ashraf साहब ने बात छोड़ी है. By the way, अस्सलाम वालेकुम Ashraf साहब, long time no see. Yeah, he was my neighbor at some point in time when I was in Karachi, so काफी अच्छा हो गया सर आपसे.
देख लें, there is a show on the roof.
Yeah. So जो एक फंडामेंटल अमेंडमेंट इस वक्त की है स्टेट में, जो प्रपोज की गई है एक्ट के अंदर, दैट इज क्लैरिटी ऑन द ऑब्जेक्टिव्स. वो एग्जिस्टिंग एक्ट में नहीं है. आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट मेकिंग वेरी क्लियर व्हाट शुड बी द प्राइम ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ सेंट्रल बैंक, व्हिच हैज बीन आर्टिकुलेटेड के जी प्राइस स्टेबिलिटी, और एज लोग उसको लूजली इंटरप्रेट करते हैं इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग, which is slightly different, but broadly speaking, very similar thing. It should be the primary objective, and then if that is satisfied, they should pursue financial stability, and if those things, two things are in place, then they can actually support other government policies. That clarity was not there in the existing law, and that has created several problems. Number one being accountability or lack of it. In the sense, nobody knows who is responsible for what. Because once you give multiplicity of objectives to any institution, it becomes difficult to say, and then there are multiple institutions involved in actually contributing to that same objective. So उसमें प्लानिंग कमीशन भी कहेगा कि जी मैंने भी कंट्रीब्यूट किया है ग्रोथ में, अपना फ्रेमवर्क दे के लॉन्ग टर्म पॉलिसी सेट करके. उसमें म्युनिसिपल फाइनेंस कहेगी जी हमारी पॉलिसी से भी ये कंट्रीब्यूट हुआ है. स्टेट बैंक अपना क्रेडिट लेने की कोशिश करेगा कि जी हमने इंटरेस्ट रेट को लेके लो रखा है और उसकी वजह से ये फायदा आया, एंड सो फोर्थ. It will never be very clear exactly who has done what. Number one. Number two, related to that, related to this one, accountability के ऊपर ही, and there are other points on accountability which I'll touch upon a bit later, which on the other side, ये आम आदमी को फायदा क्या होता है इस चीज का? ये हमारी उस दिन भी बात हो रही थी, डिस्कशन हो रही थी कि जी पाकिस्तान में फॉर इंस्टेंस के इन्फ्लेशन जो है ये कंसर्न है या नहीं है. इसका अल्टीमेट ऑब्जेक्टिव इज एक्चुअली टू ब्रिंग इन्फ्लेशन डाउन. टू माय ओपिनियन दिस इज एक्चुअली अ सीरियस एंड बिग इशू. High level of inflation and its volatility over time and over decades. We have not been able to calm it down, and one contribution is because State Bank has not been, I shouldn't say not being given autonomy, because as I said in the last seminar also, and I'll agree with the Ashraf Saab was saying, the issue is exercising the existing law. So there's a lot the central bank can do and should do to facilitate that. However, for instance, just to give you one example, government borrowing from central bank. जो लेटेस्ट राउंड था, इफ आई रिकॉल करेक्टली, जो 2012 में चेंजेस आई हैं जब मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी कमेटी फॉर्मुलेट हुई है और उसमें गवर्नमेंट बोरोइंग फ्रॉम सेंट्रल बैंक पे लिमिट्स लगी हैं. देयर वर लिमिट्स देयर. क्वार्टरली आप करेंगे, बट बाय द एंड ऑफ द क्वार्टर यू हैव टू रीपे व्हाटएवर यू बोरोड. दैट्स अ रीजनेबल फ्रेमवर्क टू बिगिन विद. अब जो नया उसके अंदर आ रहे हैं, यू सेइंग एब्सोल्युटली नो बोरोइंग. फेयर इनफ, बट इट्स नॉट गोना मेक अ बिग डिफरेंस. द क्वेश्चन इज सेंट्रल बैंक exercising its authority, as Ashraf Saab was explaining, within the existing framework? And at some times they have not. They've chosen not to exercise the legal framework that they have been given. So in a sense, Dr. Yaqub और Ashraf जो कह रहे हैं वो ठीक है, जो existing law है उसको पहले पूरी तरह implement तो करो, लेकिन जिस चीज में I'm elaborating a bit further ताकि discussion आगे बढ़े, कि जो एक amendment जो clarity दी गई directive पे वो बहुत जरूरी थी, price stability inflation पे, because ये बहुत बड़ा problem है और उस पे clarity आनी चाहिए. Last point जो है इसी बात पे कि clarity किस लिए चाहिए आपको? आपने महंगाई दे दी, फिर स्टेट बैंक को अकाउंटेबल होल्ड करना चाहिए कि जनाब हमने आपको इतनी तगदो के बाद इंडिपेंडेंस जो भी आपको चाहिए थी ऑटोनॉमी दी है, आपकी क्लैरिटी दी आपको ऑब्जेक्टिव में, योर प्राइम ऑब्जेक्टिव नाउ इज इन्फ्लेशन, शो अस दैट यू कैन डिलीवर इट एंड देन होल्ड देम अकाउंटेबल. और ये हमारी उस दिन बात हुई थी कि उसमें अकाउंटेबिलिटी के जो अमेंडमेंट्स हैं मैं उनसे पूरी तरह सेटिस्फाइड नहीं हूँ, क्योंकि वो अकाउंटेबिलिटी इतनी क्लियर नहीं है. इज जस्ट सबमिटिंग अ रिपोर्ट. You can simply explain in a report, oh, X, Y, Z things happened, and that's why the inflation is higher than what the target was given, and so on and so forth. That's not enough. You really need to take the further serious steps and have serious consequences, real consequences, if central bank deviates now in the new autonomy on this particular point. So this is one angle. There are two other points, but let's wait for the other questions, and we'll take the conversation from here. Thank you.
Yeah, Ahmed, where do you fall? Are you
Well,
for this law, or are you? Do you think this is the most important step in economic policy that needs to be taken today, on which the government should squander all its political capital?
okay, so thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak here. It's always an honor to be in your presence. So I think so. I want to sort of make 2 points here to begin with. One is I think we should definitely have this distinction in mind that as far as monetary policy is concerned, given the evidence and the consensus from the research during the last century, it's not going to matter for your long-term prosperity. Okay, so money neutrality, super neutrality, and stuff like that. So this is not really, if you are, whether you are for it or against it, this is not the immediate, this is not something which is going to define whether we are going to become, let's say, an Asian tiger or whatever, right? So that's an important distinction to keep in mind, because very often I think the conversation is somehow getting trapped into the idea as if this is going to define our long-term prosperity, right? If that's the objective, if that's something which you're concerned about, then you need to look at more sort of institutional reform than the regulatory reform that you often very, very rightly talk about. So that's the first point which we should definitely keep in mind. The other point, as per the law is concerned, again, I think the way we should again see the law is the way Hamza is sort of framing it in the context of the policy objective, right? So you can give the central bank all the autonomy you want, but unless the policy objectives are rightly defined, then what exactly are we talking about? Autonomy to do what, right? And that what, if you sort of very loosely define it in terms of the economic objectives of the government, then that objective could be anything which the government tells it, and then autonomously the central bank has to work towards achieving it. So that clarity of objectives, I think, is really important as per the law is concerned. And in that respect, I think the law is moving in the right direction. I don't have too much to say about how much autonomy should be given or how much autonomy there already is. I think the empirical evidence is rather a bit more open to that. Like when you just look at the autonomy per se, I don't think there's much of an evidence which says that one way is definitely better than the other. As long as there is de facto autonomy, I think that sort of does the job. But really, the important thing to my mind is this idea that the objectives should be clearly defined. The other reason why the objectives should be clearly defined and is inflation or price stability should be clearly defined is because like a few months back, we had the central bank saying that the inflation is under control, right? So inflation was around 7% or whatever, actually was a bit lower. Food inflation was 7% or something. And as per the state bank, everything was pretty fine. Prices were stable as defined by them. But then we have the parliamentarians who are basically complaining about the food prices rising, about the general prices rising. And that sort of inconsistency between the objective function of the central bank and the objective function of the parliamentarians really creates a significant tension, which then leads to all of these kind of interventions, which we economists often complain about, vis-a-vis intervention in the market system, setting the prices, rationing, and letting the market system work. So unless that consistency is there, there is some alignment between the objective function of the central bank and the parliament vis-a-vis what is price stability, we'll keep on sort of fighting the same wars, which are only going to distort the markets even further. So overall, just to conclude on this point, I think moving in the direction of defining the objectives much more clearly, I think that's the right step. Without that, we'll just be jumping around one regime and another regime and another regime, and that is only going to increase the volatility in the system. But yeah, I mean, with that, I mean, how much autonomy you need, I think once there is some de facto autonomy and the objectives are clearly defined, then I think at some point it sort of doesn't really make the value added from giving more and more autonomy sort of doesn't really translate too much after a point. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed Saab. Let me quickly share a couple of slides with you, if possible. Can I or can't I? It seems I can't. Some reason I can't. Okay, I can't. Okay, Janjua Saab, what I want to point out is Pakistan a very high inflation country or not? Is our primary problem inflation, or do we have any other problem? क्योंकि मुझे तो ये लग रहा है इस लॉ से और सेंट्रल बैंक के खत्मों से कि जी हमारा सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम इन्फ्लेशन है, और माशाल्लाह हमारे यहाँ इन्फ्लेशन 70-80% है, 90% है, 100% है, एंड दैट हमें इन्फ्लेशन को बिल्कुल जीरो पे ले आना है जी। इकोनॉमी चाहे कुछ भी हो जाए, इन्फ्लेशन जीरो पे आनी चाहिए। क्या ये जंजुआ साहब यू एग्री विद दिस थीसिस? या पाकिस्तान में फॉर एग्जांपल मैं ये चार्ट्स आपको दिखा रहा था कि मैंने कुछ चार्ट्स पुल डाउन किए अभी इंटरनेट से, वो दिखा रही हैं फॉर एग्जांपल कि जी हमारा इवन जो ये है, क्यों जी, क्या व्हाई कांट आई शेयर दिस थिंग यार, क्या चक्कर है, व्हाई कांट आई शेयर स्लाइड्स है? ओपन सिस्टम प्रेसिडेंट ग्रांट, पता नहीं क्या बकवास, अच्छा आई कांट शेयर स्लाइड। मैं देख रहा हूँ कि हमारी इन्फ्लेशन की जो हिस्ट्री है उसमें 2 दफ़ा शायद हुआ हमारा ये क्या कहते हैं, 2 दफ़ा हमें ये करना पड़ा है कि जी हम वो क्या कहते हैं, इन्फ्लेशन हमारी 2 दफ़ा 20% पे गई है। उसके बाद तुम्हारी इन्फ्लेशन 9-10% के करीब रही है। तो क्या जंजुआ सब हमारी इन्फ्लेशन जीरो होनी चाहिए, 7-8-9 ठीक है?
नहीं जी, जीरो तो बड़ा मुश्किल है। और पहले मैं एक चीज आपसे ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि जो इस वक्त हमारा मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी के बारे में जो ऑब्जेक्टिव है, वो स्टेट बैंक के एक्ट में कहता है मॉनेटरी स्टेबिलिटी। व्हाट इज द मीनिंग ऑफ मॉनेटरी स्टेबिलिटी? Does it include price stability and exchange rate competitiveness, or is it just a very loose term? The people who compiled this, they got away with it. But monetary stability is a very, very comprehensive term. Anyway, that is beside the point. Now, zero inflation, I don't think it is a possible. The economic agents do expect some increase in prices, maybe 4%, 5%, or something that is absolutely minimum, without which I think economic activity will come to virtually stand still. So, but at the same time, any inflation rate of inflation, whether it is 9, 10, or 15, that makes the economic agents run away from money and go to the real investment, whether it is in commodities or in gold and all that. That is something that will not be acceptable. So there has to be something that is a tolerable inflation, which still gives some credence to monetary policy.
Okay. So, Hamza Malik, you've been in the research wing and working with the Monetary Policy Committee. Give me ideas of when the government interfered with your inflationary desires.
Lots of examples. First of all, I don't agree with the thesis. Absolutely, fundamentally disagree with this thesis that Pakistan inflation is not a serious issue. It's a fundamentally serious issue. It impedes, and it has impeded, according to the empirical evidence, the long-term growth prospects of the country. The biggest contribution of a central bank to the long-term growth prospects of a country is actually keeping price stability. It gives an environment for investment. It gives an element of certainty, and so on and so forth. So, and number one. Number two, who's talking about zero inflation? I've never heard anything that like before. Nobody is saying that at all, actually. Pakistan inflation average, according to our report, we just came out last week, average, and depending on how you calculate the average, talking about the 12-month average, 2020, we use the calendar year, it's 10.8, around 10%, let's say. The entire region, Asia-Pacific region, is 3%.
Sorry, ये बता दें, what time period?
Sorry?
What time period?
2020.
2020,
The estimated,
1 year.
2021 key estimated is about 8 point, and this is talking about S-cap. We use a different time period, not necessarily the fiscal year. It's about 8%. The point I'm simply making is not the numbers calculations here. I'm simply saying the entire Asia-Pacific region, which has 53 countries, the average is under 4%, 3.8% to be precise. So Pakistan's inflation is about 2.5 to 3 times more than the rest of the Asia. So to me, it's a very non-serious statement when somebody says, oh, Pakistan inflation is not an issue. And number two, and the kind of point that I think Ashraf Saab was trying to allude to, the term monetary stability, inflation for the sake of fair control inflation is not fun. You're essentially trying to give purchasing power to the piece of currency that the government is issuing. That's what really matters. And there are all bunch of other economic variables that go into that consideration. One of them tends to be wages. So if people are struggling to continue to purchase the same basket of goods, and their salaries are not going up, for instance, or their earnings are not sufficient to cover for that, they will take the pinch, even if inflation is 4% or 10% or whatever. So inflation, however you define it, has to be much lower than what it is in Pakistan. That to me is very, very clear. आपका जो direct question था कि पाकिस्तान में किस तरह interference होती रही है, उसके दो तीन जो चीजें हैं which creates havoc with the monetary policy making, being especially with the objective of price stability. One is very erratic, very volatile, almost limitless government borrowing of central bank. Direct borrowing, unannounced. I mean, it's just been crazy virtually, in my opinion. Especially since 2007-8 onwards, it has been going up and up and up and up very, very drastically. In simple terms, it actually entails a huge injection of liquidity. Even if it is in a controlled manner, you can say on quarterly basis, X number is going to be injected through this instrument. Fair enough, one can try and manage, anticipate, and adjust policy instruments accordingly to try and anchor inflation expectation. That has not been the case in Pakistan. So number one reason why how government interference, the kind of question, the question you pose, creates problems for price stability in Pakistan is government borrowing. The other is the direct conflict of interest, which has been an issue when Secretary of Finance, as a representative Ministry of Finance, has been sitting in the monetary policy decision-making processes and keeping interest rates unnecessarily low for long periods of time when all sorts of indicators or the research done by central banks showed it should not be the case. Consequence, we did not achieve the price stability we were aiming for. The third element is actually much more problematic, is the exchange rate interventions, which touches upon your inflation rate as well, but more so it actually leads to balance of payment crisis in Pakistan. So the kind of overvaluation of currencies we have seen in the recent past in Pakistan that has been based on, I would say, pretty much direct dictation coming from the Ministry of Finance, or central bank on the other side showing a lot of weakness. It's not central banks are angels. They showed a lot of weakness in not sticking their legal framework out and say, look, this is not going to happen. When central bank has tried to do that, people have lost their jobs. I quoted about 5 governors named in the last seminar, from Shamshad Akhtar to Ashraf Watra, who did not complete their tenure. It's not a joke when a governor of a country, governor of central bank of a country resigns. Something fundamentally is wrong. So the third element is exchange rate dictation that we get from Ministry of Finance, which creates problems, balance of payment crisis, inflation goes always significantly high, growth prospects are weakened, so consequences are quite real. Now, interesting question is, which requires debate is, does the central bank law amendment will help on this line or not? That's, I think, we are trying to zero in a lot more, right? That's what I was alluding to in the first comment, which Ahmed was elaborating further. First step is clarify what you're aiming for, and then give them the instrument, give them the operational independence to go for that. But then definitely hold them accountable. If you don't do that, you're not going to go far. Let me make one small observation. We can pick up if you're interested in that point. And we were talking about it the other day. For a lot of macro policies, including monetary policies, country needs effective coordination. So I don't agree with the amendment that has proposed to abolish the Monetary and Fiscal Policies Coordination Board. Like Nadeem, you were saying the other day also, country need, at least the policymakers need to be aware of the alternative macro scenarios, how the fiscal authority is looking at how the economy should be going or where they're headed, what are their plans, what is coming from the Planning Commission regarding the growth prospects, what exactly central bank is doing or intending to do, and so on and so forth. And that needs to be debated, discussed in a formal institutional platform. In the amended version, they've actually abolished it and simply saying governor as an individual and finance minister as an individual will coordinate. That's really, really bad proposal, bad idea. It really leads to absolutely non-transparent way of working. You need a formal institutional mechanisms where you have formal minute taking, records, and those records need to be made public over time. So people understand what is being discussed and not discussed and who is saying what and so on and so forth. That facilitates the accountability over time of all the macro institutions concerned. So law will only give you some direction. The whole idea is actually whether you exercise what is already in the law or not. I pause here, but this is what I was wanting to make it very clear, that there are a lot of interventions that happen. Law is not going to make them go away.
Janjua Saab, let me ask you, कि आप तो वहाँ थे 1990s में जबकि फॉरेन करेंसी का क्राइसिस था, उसमें एक्सचेंज रेट का क्या एपिसोड था? क्या हुकूमत ने रोकी हुई थी, आपने रोकी हुई थी, क्या चीज़ थी? और जब हमने फॉरेन करेंसी डिपॉजिट्स पे डिफ़ॉल्ट किया तो क्या हुकूमत ने कहा था कि उनको हम छीन लें या स्टेट बैंक ने कहा था या क्या था?
देखिए वो उस वक्त फॉरेन करेंसी अकाउंट्स को तो लिबरलाइज किया गया 1991 में या 90 में था, और वो नवाज शरीफ की रिजीम थी। अब उसमें हुआ ये कि उसको कोई उसकी स्पेसिफिक पॉलिसी नहीं थी कि इस पैसे को करना क्या है। नतीजा ये हुआ कि हर एक ने उस पैसे को खर्च करना शुरू कर दिया। All the departments, whether it was the defense people or whether it was the civilian governments or ministries, and all, the result was that in a matter of few years, there was nothing left, and money was coming in and it was going out. So a time came when we simply could not meet the liabilities, and that was the time of crisis. And I will say that it's something, an exchange rate which we could not manage at that time. Now, at that time, the recommendations of the state bank was that you devalue the rupee, let me say 50 rupees to $1, and give it rupee to the people, and they will be satisfied. But that was not done, and they kept at 44 or 46, and that created a crisis.
Okay, but the state bank recommendation was to give them 50 rupees when the rest of the world, the market rate was 64. Is that right?
So, yeah, yes. Well, sir, 64, but maybe a few transactions took place. That was not the rate. The official rate was 44, which was made 46. But I think, if I can recollect, perhaps Dr. Yaqub must be knowing it. Dr. Yaqub's recommendation was that give them at 50, and that will be more realistic, and people will be quite satisfied with that rather than raising all sort of hullabaloo.
अहमद साहब, मैं आपकी तरफ आ जाता हूँ। अहमद साहब बताइए, ये जो मतलब हमजा मलिक ने बड़ी अच्छी बात की कि the problem is real wages, but we must worry about inflation, not the wage rate. तो इन्फ्लेशन अगर 10% पे होगी और ग्रोथ रेट अगर 3% पे होगी, और इन्फ्लेशन के लिए हम और भी इकोनॉमी को क्रंच करें और नीचे ले आए 5% पे, और ग्रोथ रेट बेशक नेगेटिव हो जाए, ये अच्छी बात है? अहमद साहब बताइए।
Yeah, I think the question again sort of comes back to what should be the optimal level of inflation, right? So, and then again, so theoretically, empirically, we don't know too much about what should be the right rate of inflation. I mean, theoretically, if you look at the Friedman rule, that sort of says it should be the minus of the real interest rate. So in the case of these economies, it ends up being minus 2%. Many other models, they all sort of end up throwing a number which is close to 0%. But I mean, these are all macro models, but then empirically, there's not, it's a bit more tricky, right? I mean, the cost of inflation, again, over the long term, it normally ends up as if it doesn't really have much of a relationship with economic growth. But then Hamza is pointing to a different evidence. But nonetheless, I think the question at the end of the day is that what the central bank is concerned really over time is about stabilizing the economy, right? Whatever number you choose for inflation, you can choose 10% as your trend or the target level, or 5% as the target level. But once you have chosen that, then beyond that, the central bank is really concerned about stabilizing both inflation and output around the potential. And then comes the question, okay, so which of the monetary policy regimes is going to basically stabilize the economy in a better way? And I think that's how we should probably view this. So I don't see this as much of a problem of, okay, whether we have high inflation, and that will be a problem, let's say, over the long run. I'm not too sure about that. But really, for me, the question is which of the regimes or the monetary policy regimes is going to make sure that the economy is made relatively stable. The boom bust cycles we have been seeing so far, they can be, or at least the likelihood of that can be reduced. And I think the current system is definitely not delivering. The current system, in which we are sometimes targeting the exchange rate, sometimes we are saying we are now targeting the inflation rate, sometimes we are targeting the reserve, sometimes people say it's hot money, whatever. I think that way of running monetary policy is definitely destabilizing, to say the least. We can decide whatever the inflation rate we want, fine. We can keep it high, but we definitely have to have a clear regime, and I'll argue for a regime which is more in line with inflation targeting or price stability, given the empirical evidence in favor of it. That I think that's how we should view how this amendment should actually take shape. Because without that, irrespective of what inflation rate we decide to choose, if we keep jumping around between the kind of regimes which we use to conduct policy, then I mean, it's going to keep the system stable, destabilized, and then what's the point of any of this? So that's really how I'll view these amendments, or I'll want these amendments to take shape.
I think the issue that I'm trying to get to is, this is being posed as if it's catechism, as if it's a simple issue, and all we have to do is just follow the received wisdom कि जी सेंट्रल बैंक इंडिपेंडेंस बहुत जरूरी है और होनी चाहिए, ठीक है, while किसी और एजेंसी के पास इंडिपेंडेंस नहीं है. अभी हमजा मलिक ने कहा कि जी 5 गवर्नर्स निकल गए, तो फिर एचईसी का चेयरमैन भी निकल गया, नेपरा के कितने बंदे निकल चुके हैं. ये तो हमारे मुल्क में कोई रीत तो है नहीं, ठीक है. But yet I would say central bank has been the most stable of all institutions, and central bank has the most independence of all institutions. But here, central bank wants more independence, wants longer terms, etc. Yet I don't understand, Hamza, which we discussed the other day too, that central bank ka jo role financial markets mein hai, I find it very questionable, and there's no research to support it. Central bank खुद इतने economist host करती है, but central bank हमें कोई research तो देती नहीं है. Central bank कोई हमें बताती तो कुछ है नहीं. Central bank is a power unto itself. So should we give it more power? And Hamza Malik, there a comment on the central bank's role in the financial system. Has central bank helped or hindered the growth in the financial system?
But I do want to ask a question as well, like both to everyone here. That we are saying, okay, so let's say that the central bank has had enough independence, right, legally speaking, and let's say if they wanted to do something, they were free to do it. But then, so they were independent to do what? Right. So isn't that a problem? Like, I mean, to the panelists, to even Dr. Nadeem, this is a question for you as well. Like, what was their objective as per the law? I mean, let's say they are autonomous, whatever, fine. Maybe they were autonomous, and then given how vaguely everything has been defined, they thought maybe perhaps, okay, fine, that now we need to keep the exchange rate stable. We need to have some autonomy over controlling the business cycle. So obviously, given the trilemma, what we need to do is we need to somehow impose some kind of capital controls, right? So they, without the objectives, without any of that, they can, I mean, keep the trilemma in mind, and they can choose any of the two corners at any point in time, and then keep doing whatever they think is the right way to go by, or depending on, let's say, the preferences of the federal government. So isn't that something which is of a problem for the panelists, which needs clarification, irrespective of the level of independence out there?
No, Ahmed, let me first come to your question. I mean, you're just, I'll really strongly recommend that you actually go through central bank's monetary policy statements. There's not been too much ambiguity exactly what they are aiming for and what they're not aiming for. They have been quoting primarily both inflation and GDP growth targets and saying, this is how they're assessing the pros and cons of pursuing a certain policies consistently. So in a way, central bank has been pursuing implicit inflation targeting. So there has been no chaos or confusion. Oh, central bank is targeting capital controls, now they're doing exchange rate, now they're doing that. That is not true factually. You can read the last decade's monetary policy statements and you will learn it for yourself. So I strongly recommend those who are concerned about exactly what central bank is trying to communicate they're doing can read the monetary policy statement. The issue is whatever they are aiming. So they're saying inflation was higher than the target and lower than the target. Why? And then can more autonomy to central bank help them on this front or not? And I'm saying autonomy comes with, and I made it very clear in the last seminar also, when I'm using the term autonomy, it's talking about autonomy from the Ministry of Finance. It's a state's institution, government institution. It's not autonomy from everybody else. It's a Ministry of Finance, and I gave you examples, direct borrowing, intervention on interest rates, and especially on exchange rate front. That creates difficulties to central bank to set its policy instruments, which is the starting point, to actually start influencing, or in the academic language, start giving shape to the monetary policy transfer mechanism, and so on and so forth. And those things are discussed at length and in detail in monetary policy statements. Coming to Dr. Nadeem's question on financial stability, I think you have to really give some credit, if not a lot of credit, to the central bank in terms of financial stability and in terms of developing the financial markets. Let me give you examples from the domain of monetary policy framework. I don't know how much you know, how long ago you think let me name names here because we don't have this tradition here. As a visiting academic researching on monetary policy, I visited central bank in 2005 and 2006 before joined. I asked the then sitting governor central bank, Dr. Rashid Hussain, what is the policy instrument? And he couldn't give me a straight answer. Why? Because we used to only have treasury bills. There was no monetary policy instrument. The central bank would say, this is the starting point. Treasury bill setting actually is the fiscal instrument. It is amount of borrowing is for the government, and the price at which that borrowing takes place, is set by the government. That was the norm I'm talking about all the way up until 2005. How do you expect the financial market is going to develop when you're not going to have any yield curve of any sort? You're going to only borrow 3 months, 6 months treasury bills at maximum 1 year treasury bills, and that's about it. There's no long-term yield curve developed, which is the basis of any financial sector development. To me, State Bank has come a long way in trying to develop that yield curve. Long way to go, a lot of weaknesses, a lot more work needs to be done, but they have come a long way, in my opinion. That's one element linked from our discussion for the monetary policy instrument and how you develop financial markets, especially in the short term, in the initially phase. Make sure they're liquid, make sure the trading takes place. When the government issues a treasury bill, it's traded in the market, its price is discovered. Based on that, the corporates are supposed to issue their instruments and so on and so forth. That entire mechanism has been missing, and I think State Bank has done a very good job in developing that. More needs to be done. That's one. Number two, I don't think so. Pakistan has experienced any severe or serious financial crisis in the country. Bank runs and things like that. That's not automatic. That is not something, just a coincidence. There is an institution who has been regulating. One can, of course, argue over-regulating maybe. Fine. That's a good research question. To which extent you should regulate or not. Vis-a-vis capital flow measures or internally not letting in new entrants and so on and so forth. Fair enough. That conversation can take place. But to say that they have not done anything to promote financial stability, that's a bit extreme. So they have done both things, in both being one, development of short-term financial market instruments and yield curve, which is the beginning and the basis of any decent financial market anywhere in the world. Now, I can elaborate a bit more on how we facilitated, central bank has facilitated development of the foreign exchange market as well. And now the last 1 or 2 years, I think it's become even better. Whatever I've been able to observe sitting from outside, the exchange rate now is reasonably market determined and we're not getting it. Whether we can sustain, whether central bank can sustain it over time, I don't know. But at the moment, we're not losing reserves on the dictation of finance ministry to defend the currency. So that's an element of financial markets. And then there has been financial stability. We haven't had crises. So more work needs to be done, but they have done a lot. We have to give them, we have to acknowledge that part at least.
Can I jump in, Dr. Nadeem? Can I say?
Dr. Nadeem, kindly unmute yourself, sir.
I find it a bit disingenuous, Ahmed, कि स्टेट बैंक को हम दे दें huge latitude. उनको इंस्ट्रूमेंट नहीं अपना पता तो कसूर फाइनेंस मिनिस्ट्री का है. अगर उनसे इन्फ्लेशन कंट्रोल नहीं होती कसूर फाइनेंस मिनिस्ट्री का है. अगर एक्सचेंज रेट मैनेज नहीं होती कसूर फाइनेंस मिनिस्ट्री का है. आई डोंट थिंक के डेली बेसिस पे कोई ऐसी डायरेक्शन आती है. मैंने खुद देखा है कि जी क्वाइट फ्रैंकली सेंट्रल बैंक हैज अ फेयर डिग्री ऑफ ऑटोनॉमी and quite okay if the government borrows, there are ways of sterilizing the borrowing, there are ways of doing things. Fine, do it by all means. Central bank has the ability to do things, but does the central bank actually do the needful? Secondly, on financial development, देखिए बात बड़ी सिंपल है. मैं पिछले वेबिनार पे 3-4 दफा कह चुका हूँ कि central bank killed the NBFI sector to maintain financial stability. I'm not sure that's a great idea. We need some competition in the financial system. और अगर किल करके चलाना है तो बड़ी अच्छी बात. सेंट्रल बैंक ने इसीलिए अभी जो कैपिटल कंट्रोल्स लगाए हैं एक्सचेंज रेट को रोकने के लिए, जिसकी वजह से एक्सचेंज रेट 165 से 153 पे आ गई है. Is that on direction of the Ministry of Finance? I think the Ministry of Finance doesn't even know about these things. The question is, while you're clarifying targets, we also have to clarify responsibility, and we should not give anybody, Ahmed, correct me if I'm right, we should not give anybody so much latitude and so much confusion in their objectives that they can get away with whatever they like. कि जी capital account बंद कर दो, inflation के लिए capital account बंद कर दो, उसके लिए या current account, चलो capital account पे लोग ग्रोएंगे, current account बंद कर दो ताकि अगर मुझे $100 भेजने हैं कोई मैगजीन लेने के लिए तो वो भी स्टेट बैंक से परमिशन आएगी, अगर बच्चे ने बाहर पढ़ने जाना है तो वो भी स्टेट बैंक से परमिशन आएगी. हम इस निज़ाम से गुजर चुके हैं. Do we want that again? Secondly, कि जनाब इस वक्त सारे big banks, even Shaukat Tareen's bank, Silk Bank is struggling to survive. It will probably die. We will probably be left with 5 banks. Is that a good idea? Yes, financial stability, हमजा ठीक कह रहे हैं. But एक बात मैं आपको याद कराऊं, मेरे पास एक चार्ट कहीं पड़ी है, I can't share the screen unfortunately, कि ईस्ट एशियन क्राइसिस जब आया था तो हम बड़े खुश थे कि हमें तो इफेक्ट नहीं किया. राइट, चार्ट जो मैंने स्टेट बैंक में भी दिखाई थी कि जी ईस्ट एशियन क्राइसिस पे यस हिकअप हुआ, लोगों को वो ऊपर चढ़ना शुरू हो गया. हम नीचे बैठे हुए थे, हम कभी ऊपर ही नहीं गए. तो उस चार्ट के नीचे मैंने लिखा हुआ था, you get a hangover if you go to a party. If you don't go to a party, you never have a hangover. ठीक है. The question is this कि जी ये एक mix है policy का. Is this law going to fix it, or do we need more than just this law? Ahmed, go ahead.
Okay, so I think I'll probably pick up on one of the things which Hamza said. Let me share this screen here. So this episode which we are looking at here, right? So the crisis and before that the boom. I think the way I see this, I mean, we can get into who was dictating what. This crisis is really a failure of monetary policy to me. You can see clearly this is when the debt bubble is building up. The central bank is making sure that the interest rates remain low. And at the same time, it's somehow sterilizing the market so that the exchange rate remains fixed. And then that sort of stays all the way there. And then obviously, then the bubble has grown big enough, and that then it sort of collapses, right? And then you're sort of forced into increasing the interest rates because then there's no way out of it. So this kind of volatility, which is obviously supported or fueled by the central bank making whatever decisions they are making, this is obviously what we want to avoid. And this is costly. And this is a crisis. We can call it a currency crisis. We can call it a financial crisis, depending on how we define financial crisis. But nonetheless, this is a crisis. This is a very costly crisis. And this is a crisis which we don't want to go through again and again, as we have been going through during our history. So I think that's what I have in my mind when I think about autonomy, fine, but then clarity of objectives and the instruments, they are really important when we are to think about how to somehow minimize these fluctuations, which we have been going through since ever. And then at the same time, I think it's also, so having said that, coming back to your point, yes, I mean, it's important again to make sure what the central bank is up to and the instruments they have available, right? So your point of, or likewise Hamza's point of what is the instrument, that obviously raises a question, because once again, there's nothing defined. You can decide to do whatever you want because there's nothing out there to restrict you from doing anything other than the idea of achieving some sort of vague objectives. So, I mean, I'm sort of going again back to the same point over and over, but I think that's something which needs to be resolved. You can't just give the autonomy to the central bank, not define the instruments, not define the objectives, and then somehow we hope that things are going to work out. I'll rather actually prefer, if really I was forced to sort of pick and choose, I'll actually choose the clarity of objectives a lot more vigorously over, let's say, giving them, let's say, explicit autonomy. As long as the objectives are well defined and the government is also on board, that these are the objectives and these are the instruments which are to be used towards this purpose, then I think that is going to, that will be a step in the right direction. Otherwise, I mean, you can, irrespective of that, the way to control, you've got so many different ways of controlling inflation, right? I mean, you can keep the exchange rate under control, and that will keep inflation under control. That's pretty fine. I mean, it seems to have done pretty well for hyperinflation countries. But again, that's destabilizing. So unless we sort of keep the room open where everything can be interpreted in every way we want, I think this is, we will keep on going through the same cycles again and again. So I think that's, so this,
I have a 10-minute clarification on Ahmed's 10-second clarification to Ahmed's observation. Maybe I didn't complete my thought earlier. The instrument clarity was not there in 2005. Since then, there has been extreme clarity on the instrument side. That's the point I was trying to make. I was responding to Dr. Nadeem's concern, linking that with the financial sector. But State Bank has been very, very clear after 2005-6 in terms of what exactly is the instrument, how they target that, what exactly is the interest rate corridor, how they conduct over market operations. The data is available online. They have been extremely clear on that part. Just to clarify on that.
Sorry.
Well, Nadeema, I will say a couple of things. Now, the State Bank will to give objectives, make it clear, but two things are very important. Number one, you have to control the lending to the government. The government perhaps it will not be easy to stop government from borrowing from the banking system. That's extremely important. That has to be contained. And the second thing is that the choice of governor and his tenure. I would say a governor should be familiar with the rudiments of monetary policy, banking, and all that. Plus, he should have good advice from them. And the most important thing is that he should have a security of tenure. As Hamza said, in fact, I can say more things. In fact, at least 3 governors were not only told to go home, but some of them were fired. And finance minister just decided that this man should be appointed. It's very important that the governor should be familiar. He should know what is the difference between the commercial banks and the central bank. Central bank has its own personality, and if you have a look at the previous governors, they were either bureaucrats or bankers. I would say very few of them are economists, and even them, I would say, in certain cases, the experience was not particularly helpful. So I think these two things are very important. There has to be a tap on the government borrowing. The government borrowing has to be subject to the monetary policy objectives of the State Bank, and the governor's personality, his appointment, and his credentials and minimum qualifications. That is a subject which must be considered. Thank you.
But none of this will be handled by the law. The law is a totally different issue. These things are all cultural, and the way we work, as I said, Tariq Banouri was fired a few days ago, regardless of term. And so many other people have been fired left, right, and center. It doesn't matter. And that's all that happened. Hafiz Sheikh was fired despite whatever. So quite frankly, वो तो हमारा culture है. तो culture को छोड़ दे. हमारी law जो है, उसमें जो मुझे नजर आ रहा है, वो बड़ा important चीज है. हमजा साहब, please बताइए कि पहली चीज तो स्टेट बैंक कहता है 5 साल की रिसर्च इस पे की, हम 5 साल की रिसर्च हमें बताए ना. और स्टेट बैंक एक बड़ा सीक्रेटिव इदारा है. It's not trying to come out and talk to people. तो क्या इतने सीक्रेटिव इदारे को हम कैसे कंट्रोल करेंगे, कैसे हम उसकी अकाउंटेबिलिटी करेंगे? नंबर 2, ये बात पहले भी हो चुकी है, किसी को क्लैरिटी नहीं है. प्राइस स्टेबिलिटी जो मैं बार बार इंसिस्ट कर रहा हूँ इन्फ्लेशन पे, एंड आई डोंट एग्री विद यू एट ऑल. पाकिस्तान इज अ लो इन्फ्लेशन कंट्री. आई थिंक ये हम आई मीन एवरीबडी हैज दिस थिंग. जैसे कि एनआरएसपी है, एनआरएसपी कहती है रूरल पॉवर्टी खत्म ही नहीं होती, वो बढ़ाई जाती है रूरल पॉवर्टी. इसी तरह वर्ल्ड बैंक कहता है पॉवर्टी दुनिया में खत्म ही नहीं हो रही, हालांकि गिरती जाती है पॉवर्टी. कहते नहीं, पॉवर्टी हम रीडिफाइन कर लेते हैं. हर एजेंसी, मिशन क्रीप क्या होता है? मिशन क्रीप, एवरी एजेंसी लाइक्स टू डिफाइन a target for itself that will keep it afloat. So are we trying to define the central bank target high inflation and we must do something, or are we able to define the optimal inflation? Jo Ahmed ne bhi baat ki, what is the optimal inflation target for Pakistan and who will define it? How will it happen? Second question, Hamza Saab, what is the nominal anchor in Pakistan? What is the nominal anchor the central bank has been pursuing up till now? And what is the nominal anchor going forward? And has that nominal anchor been fixed by the central bank or by the Ministry of Finance? Ji Hamza Saab. Hamza, unmute yourself, my friend.
Got it. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
I can hear you.
So
Go ahead.
I don't think so. State Bank is any secretive with that or anything. You can visit the central bank's website and find all sorts of data. And over the years, they have been increasing the availability of data in the public domain. That's for sure. So I don't think that's fair to say, oh, State Bank is very secretive. Yes, over time it used to be, but recently it's been amazing actually.
We're not talking about
they have put.
not talking about data. Data to hum sabko mil jata hai. Data has no problem. Data to mil jayega. What about central bank thoughts and sharing their own thinking? जैसे कि law 5 साल से बना रहे हैं.
With whom? Nadeem, with whom? What do you mean hum? Hum कौन है? Citizens की बात कर रहे हैं ना? आप country की बात कर रहे हैं, right? Right. So central bank
citizens of the world.
Right. So central bank regularly publishes is research in working papers. It comes up with a monetary policy statement. Last I checked, every 2 months. It comes up with a quarterly report of the economy. It shares its research. It's not pulled out of thin air. You simply put it on data and write some specific issues. I don't even understand what you're trying to say. State Bank doesn't share with what, with whom. It does. The question that you were sharing the other day, that's an important one. The central bank do prepare a lot of macroeconomic scenarios of the country. They are meant to be discussed with policymakers, and they should be discussed. They are not meant for public domain, and they should not be for public domain. The essence of the recommendations of the institutions should be made public. The mechanical details, the background research for that doesn't have to be. There are all sorts of sensitivities in those data. You're giving 3 years ahead exchange rate, for instance, in those discussions. The question you raised the other day, the important one is, those should be available to Finance Ministry and the other way around. Finance Ministry should share its 3-year fiscal framework with us, with central bank at a platform institution. That's why I was saying having a functioning monetary policy and fiscal coordination board is critical to have this exchange at the policy level. For the public domain, central bank has been moving in the direction of more and more transparency. I recall we spent almost 3 or 3.5 years trying to make sure the public debt data is available to the public. 3.5 years the finance ministry resisted, couldn't even agree on the definitions. You look at the data, it is as good as anywhere in the world, with all the aggregates, disaggregates, the history being given and reported on a timely manner. The banking data. So that is, to me, is actually least of the concerns at the moment. The state bank is secretive. Absolutely not. Absolutely not in that sense. The nominal anchor part what we're talking about is,
why will it not share the law with the people of Pakistan?
Because law is under consideration. It's being proposed. It's been discussed at the policy level. It's an ongoing research, ongoing work of central bank as shared. It's, in my knowledge, it maybe go back even further, but at least these discussions are going on in the central bank since 2007 and 8. They have been discussed with the relevant quarters all over the place. I agree at some stage, these should be discussed at these platforms.
People of Pakistan?
At some stage, they should be discussed. That's what I'm saying. At these kind of platforms, they should be discussed also.
After the law has been passed, they'll share it with us.
No. That's, I agree with you to the part that they should discuss it beforehand, before going to Parliament.
ये मेरी आप लोगों से disagreement है. I think we have a moral hazard. We people who are in policy have a moral hazard too. We like to define our task to make it easy for ourselves. We like to hide information to make it easy for ourselves. I prefer, and this has been not me, the world has learned through history. That is how Fed opened up, the fund opened up, everybody opened up, because realized too many mistakes were made through secrecy. There is no reason to hide the law. Give it to everybody. Let people discuss it. Let us not remain in the dark. And secondly,
the existing law is available on central bank's webpage. The amendments are going through legal process. You have to wait out the process. What I'm agreeing with you is that before going to the amendments, they should have been floated in the public domain through some think tank discussion, and these are the ideas.
That's all I wanted. Yeah, good.
Right. That's water under the bridge now, but yes. But the law is available online, and there are not too many fundamental changes to that law, as we have been discussing. The whole idea to me is boiling down to, is the law going to make central bank more effective or not? That's what we're talking about, right?
Answer my question. What was the nominal anchor in the past for the central bank?
It has been again, in my understanding, for a very long time, inflation. And by very long time means at least a couple of decades, or at least mid-2000s onwards.
Inflation has been a nominal anchor.
The decision, the discussion, the framing of monetary policy statements has been around inflation target given to the central bank from the government. They have been
So
anchoring their decisions around that.
So we are
And they have
already
been finding it difficult to deliver that because of so many reasons that we have discussed.
so we are already in an inflation targeting mode.
In my understanding, we have been in an implicit, by implicit means not announced, but implicit inflation targeted mode for a very long time now. What we mess up over time again and again, which creates genuine problems, and that's where the central bank is responsible for, all these episodes of crises, exchange rate crises in particular, right? That creates problem. People think, oh, central bank is now targeting exchange rate. They're keeping it overvalued. And that's what I was sharing. This is not of the doing, at least the last episode of the central bank.
Fair enough.
But
Let me bring in Adib Syed from the central bank too. Adib Saab, bataiye. What do you think? What has been the nominal target of the central bank? Nominal anchor. What has been the nominal anchor of the central bank, Adib Saab?
Again, this is my own views, not the views of central bank. So
No, of course.
जो Hamza साहब ने बोला, क्योंकि Hamza साहब has been around as the director of monetary policy for a long time, so he knows better, and he was right. Inflation has been the nominal anchor for State Bank of Pakistan. Upon my return from the US, I wanted to meet Hamza Saab and ask this question. So I am really thankful to this platform that I can ask this question now, and in presence of large public. That Hamza Saab, जब वो हमारे जो गवर्नर हैं मोहम्मद अयूब साहब ये कह रहे थे कि पहले साल के बाद कभी फिस्कल और मॉनेटरी कोऑर्डिनेशन बोर्ड ने कभी मीटिंग सही से की नहीं और जो है पॉलिसीज की कोऑर्डिनेशन नहीं की, तो आप हमें ये बता सकते हैं कि ड्यूरिंग योर टेनर हियर एट स्टेट बैंक ऑफ पाकिस्तान फिस्कल साइड की पॉलिसीज को साथ लेकर जब चलना होता था, तो व्हाट वाज द प्रोसीजर, हाउ वुड दे अप्रोच यू एंड हाउ वुड यू डील विद इट? ये मेरा एक सवाल है आपसे। और मैं दूसरा एक दो चीज़ें क्लियर करना चाहता हूँ कि स्टेट बैंक के जो रिसर्च पेपर्स हैं वो मेरे ख्याल में मार्केट में इतने पढ़े नहीं जाते। आई थिंक दे शुड बी रेड मोर एंड मोर, बिकॉज 1970 से लेके 2000 तक का एक पेपर है रियाजुद्दीन साहब का, थ्रेशोल्ड लेवल ऑफ इन्फ्लेशन इन पाकिस्तान। उसमें वो उन्होंने ये दिखाया इम्प्लिसिटी के इन्वेस्टमेंट ग्रोथ और जो आउटपुट ग्रोथ है वो 9% पे जाके नेगेटिव हो जाती है, विच मीन्स threshold level for those 34 years was 9%. So it means that research can be repeated for the current era by someone, and maybe we will be able to find the new threshold now. दूसरी बात है कि लोगों में ये भी रुझान है कि स्टेट बैंक ऑफ पाकिस्तान फॉरवर्ड लुकिंग सेंट्रल बैंक नहीं है, लेकिन मेरे ख्याल में once again we miss the point कि what is the central bank trying to give to public. अगर सेंट्रल बैंक फॉरवर्ड लुकिंग वो नहीं है, सेंट्रल बैंक नहीं है आपका, तो वो कभी भी कंज्यूमर कॉन्फिडेंस इंडेक्स, बिजनेस इंडेक्स, परचेजिंग मैनेजर्स इंडेक्स और इन्फ्लेशन इंडेक्स को कभी भी, एक्सपेक्टेशंस इंडेक्स को कभी भी डिस्कस ना करे अपनी मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी स्टेटमेंट्स में। तो वो एक पब्लिक डॉक्यूमेंट है। आई वुड हाईली रिकमेंड, एंड सेकंड हमजा साहब व्यू के मार्केट को बिफोर क्रिटिसाइजिंग स्टेट बैंक ऑफ पाकिस्तान के ऑटोनॉमी सिर्फ इस इदारे को चाहिए। वन ऑफ द क्रिटिकल आई एम क्रिटिकल ऑफ यू एज वेल नदीम साहब के, जब से वेबिनार शुरू हुए हैं कि आप इस बात पे बहुत ज्यादा पॉन्डर कर रहे हैं कि सिर्फ सेंट्रल बैंक को क्यों ऑटोनॉमी दी जाए। असल में तो प्रॉब्लम यही है कि जब 90% ऑफ बैंक्स इन्वेस्टमेंट इज इन गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज, व्हाई वुड दे गो फॉर प्राइवेट सेक्टर क्रेडिट? और फिर दूसरी बात है कि अगर आपको ये इंसेंटिव मौजूद है गवर्नमेंट के पास कि यू कैन ऑलवेज गो एंड बोरो फ्रॉम द मार्केट और सेंट्रल बैंक, तो अगर सेंट्रल बैंक जीरो बोरोइंग नहीं करेगा तो देयर विल बी नो इंसेंटिव ऑफ मेकिंग योर एफबीआर स्ट्रॉन्गर। ये जो हम रजा बाकिर साहब हैं, इन्होंने अपने लास्ट प्रोग्राम में जो है कही भी थी ये बात। तो ये मेरे 3-4 पॉइंट थे। और हमजा अली मलिक साहब से मेरा यही सवाल है कि आई वुड हैव बीन मच मोर फॉर्चुनेट टू सिट विद यू इन पर्सन एंड आस्क दिस क्वेश्चन, बट हमें बताएं कि जब आप पॉलिसी मेकिंग करते थे यहाँ पे, तो फिस्कल साइड से आप कैसे कोऑर्डिनेट करते थे विदाउट having any framework, proper framework?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Ateeb. Good to see you. Thanks for the question. Directly बड़ा simple सा है। मैं तकरीबन 7.5 साल रहा हूँ स्टेट बैंक में मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी में, और मैं टोटल 4 नहीं तो 5 मीटिंग हुई होंगी मॉनेटरी एंड फिस्कल पॉलिसी कोऑर्डिनेशन बोर्ड की। The secretariat used to be in my department. We kept calling for the meeting multiple times. Official letter used to go to the finance ministry calling for a meeting. They never convened it, right? So whatever. And number two, when they were convened, they were as pathetic as it could be. I think Nadeem was witness to one of them. I've witnessed to three of them actually out of the 5 or 6 that were held. Pathetic in the sense, no meaningful conversation, no sharing of proper information from the central bank side and from the fiscal side. So that, for all practical purposes, at least between 2007 and 2014, that was a redundant body. So that answers your question directly. But the more interesting question that you ask is how the coordination used to actually take place. There's a fortunate side to it and the unfortunate side. The fortunate side is, in a way, which is also unfortunate, but we were in the IMF program continuously, almost. So when you're in the IMF program, by default, you're expected to share all sorts of information. You means the country, from the fiscal side and from the monetary side. So we used to get a lot of fiscal data while in the IMF program. But the moment we used to get out of the IMF program, no information sharing from the finance ministry. How do you get the information? And this is sad reality, but I'm sharing it in public actually. You cultivate personal relationships. If you get along, my counterpart used to be the additional secretary on the other side. If you know him well, get along very well, he or she will share the data. Otherwise, no. So that's what I've been repeating again and again. You have to have available official platforms where the institutions involved, State Bank, Finance Ministry, Planning Commission, should be mandated to share the requisite information, at least at the policy level for sure. We struggled. I mean, I have it bound actually eventually. It's a mini booklet, the amount of letters we have written to the Finance Ministry requesting for information so we can take informed decisions before the Monetary Policy Committee. There are close to 50 letters, right? We have never received a response from them, right? So Ministry of Finance has been absolutely ruling the roast without any accountability. There's nothing personal here. To me, the babus, the bureaucrats actually are just not accountable for anything. They can wreak havoc with the country. In the end, they get elevated. We had people like Dr. Waqar Masood, under whose watch we had balance payment crisis twice. And now he's sitting as the advisor to the government. So this country doesn't have much recollection at times to hold people accountable for what the jobs they're supposed to deliver. If a country goes in the right balance of payment crisis, I think Governor Central Bank, Secretary Finance, Finance Minister should be explicitly asked in the National Assembly what went wrong. We don't know these kind of questions. So the short answer, I mean, coming back to your question is, it's a very informal way of getting information and not getting information.
That is the question, unfortunately. So what will the law solve? Kyun Ahmed Saab, will the law solve anything in this milieu where nobody knows what they are doing? PSTP is a political instrument. Finance, the budget is a political instrument. The only semblance of discipline that we get is in the IMF program. And then everybody follows the IMF program blindly, without any negotiation, without any thought. Ahmed Saab, do you think the law will solve that problem?
Nadeem, sorry to interrupt your last part of the question. I take exception to that. When you say follow blindly IMF program or not, I've sat 8 years in 2 programs. We argue for 2 weeks. We do have our own programs, and we have managed successfully to negotiate different frameworks and implemented different policies than prescribed to the IMF. So let's not make these sweeping statements that we have absolutely no capacity to argue or discuss and negotiate. Pakistan is doing reasonably well. The problem is, of course, not enough, because we're still continuing in the IMF lab.
Well, Hamza, I'm very happy with your analysis of the situation, but I've seen it from all sides. And quite frankly, I've seen the negotiation, which was, for example, on the value-added tax, we caved in without having even understanding what we are doing. Same thing on this thing, central bank independence. For example, just now we got a review with 4, performance criteria being waived. We've got the last program, we had every performance criteria being waived and nothing was achieved. So I think, quite frankly, we can argue on that too. We'll have another webinar on the IMF program. And,
Yes.
I've also had 3 webinars with Masood Ahmed, with Adnan Mazrai, and with so many people, and they all say the same thing. This is a well-known fact. We can't negotiate. We don't negotiate. We just sign. And that's the isko ab theek hai, we can give it other spins.
I disagree. As an eyewitness, I disagree.
Fair enough. I've recorded your disagreement. But as I said, I've seen that very closely from both sides. And quite frankly, the frustration even on the IMF side is that, guys, you don't come up with anything. You just sit there and just sign whatever you like. So anyways, we will disagree on that. Ahmed Saab, bataiye.
I think the law will solve anything only if there is a political ownership of that, right? I mean, we know that in the US, the Federal Reserve was sort of made a bit more independent in 51. But then you have Nixon and Arthur Burns, And they basically screwed up the economy just because they wanted easy money or they had their own views of how the economy should work. And later on, you have got like Paul Volcker, he comes in, but then he's very much supported by Carter and Reagan when he was sort of implementing his agenda. So I think at the end of the day, even if the law is there, obviously you need some sort of ownership of the law from the political regime. And then if it's perceived as IMF, then obviously it's just going to stay there as another piece of law, which we have many of. I think that's one reason why I keep insisting. I think that where the inflation objective or the price stability, how should that be defined or where should it come from? I personally still think, despite the discussion here, that it should come from the parliament, right? So, I mean, unless we bring them on board on what price stability means, we'll always be in a fix where state bank thinks that the prices are stable, but the parliament thinks that the prices are not stable and some sort of price intervention or market committees need to be formed to sort of control prices. So I think that's a very good way to sort of give them the opportunity to define price stability so we can get done with it and they own it up later on as well. Without their ownership, I think it's just like it's a law which is just going to stay there, like that fiscal responsibility law which we also
हमजा ने अभी कहा, वो भी interesting बात है. The politicians don't matter. It's the bureaucrats who control everything.
No, but then I think at some level, bureaucrats control everything. But then at the other level, when it comes to price stability, it's really the trust of having market committees, the trust of having all of these interventions or basically banning exports or imports. That's really driven by politicians, right? Who are the public representatives, and they are sort of being blamed by the people for not being able to control prices. You have the prime minister, like you wake up and think that the prices are stable as defined by the state bank. And then you also read a news where the prime minister is saying, that he's going to pass, or the government is saying that they are going to bring an ordinance to control prices. So that sort of inconsistency between the objectives, who's defining what price stability means, is obviously that needs to be resolved. And I think in a way, this is a good opportunity that the law is out there for the parliament to debate it and for them to define price stability and then obviously own it up and leave it to the state bank to achieve it using interest rate as their policy instrument.
Hamza Saab, not Hamza Malik. Another Hamza wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Hamza Saab. Please introduce yourself and ask a question. Hamza Saab, are you there? I think he's gone. Chalein ji. So let me go back to Ashraf Saab. Ashraf Saab, bataiye, any last thoughts?
B.
Ji, Ashraf Saab.
बस बात यह है जी कि somebody has to own the policies, as rightly been said. Who owns the policies? Is there anybody who can control the Ministry of Finance and not borrowing from the banking system? Unless you have a strong fiscal policy, there will always be the long shadows on the monetary policy. Okay. But the most important thing is that I think you should have a governor who is knowledgeable, with character and clear objectives, and define what price stability is. कभी तो हमें ये नहीं पता कि price stability है क्या. And I think about financial stability, I think we have done quite well, because financial stability comes from two things. Number one, that the institution must be able to meet their liabilities. And number two, that their activities, their balance sheets, or their paper must reflect the fundamentals of the economy for the guidance of investors. And I think the financial stability has been a fairly good achievement. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ji. Kyun Ji, Hamza Saab, any last words? You think financial stability?
I'll echo what Ashraf Saab said. This is exactly what I tried to conclude last time also. Unless and until we don't put fiscal policy in place or fiscal house in order, this debate of what is price stability, why central bank is not achieving price stability will not go away. The moment you put limits on central bank borrowing, the borrowing from the commercial bank is going to shoot up, and it's going to create many other problems. And again, the source will be finance ministry or fiscal authority. So I 100% agree with Ashraf. This is the ideal way to conclude this conversation. Please, and the two things, I'll add one more. One of them is this Ashraf Janjwa Saab's point that please put emphasis on putting capacity in the fiscal authority to come up with some decent policy, exactly what is fiscal policy and how to go about doing that and all that. The other one is we really need to have conversation in the country, a serious one, not mudflinging, on why we are continuously in the IMF program since 1988. Who is responsible? Which institution is responsible? Of course, there's a role by central bank. Of course, there's a role by finance. But why can't we have a decent discussion in saying why, on average, every 2.5 years we go belly up and we are bailed out by IMF? To me, it's a very reasonable, basic question, given that it's been 30+ years. It's irrespective of political regimes. You have all colors of political parties have had governments and military regimes, and even then, the outcome has remained the same. That impinges directly on the economic sovereignty of the country, and we have not answered this question, why this is the case. I quote here last one, a good one actually, it just came across my WhatsApp, and it's as if, very, very pertinent for this one. Good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will find a way around the laws. That is a quote from Plato. So to me, this is what it is. Law is only a law and only as good as if you implement it. Otherwise, people will always find a way around it. Thank you very much.
Well said, well said. There you go, folks. I think we've had enough of central bank independence. The main point that I wanted to show you was, unfortunately, we don't want to fix the elephant in the room, which is the colonial system of governance, where nothing works. Everything is based on the East India Company, which is now gone. The tragedy is we make bad law, bad policy everywhere. So when we make bad law, bad policy, we say, okay, dump it and let's make a project management unit. So you've got tons of project management units that are independent, that don't do well, costs of a project go up. Then we dump that, we say, let's do another World Bank project, we make that doesn't do well, we dump it, we move on. Then we say HEC, education department doesn't work, let's make HEC. Then we want to kill HEC. We have had a graveyard of institutions. I wrote about this yesterday and lots of comment on this on Twitter. We've got a graveyard of institutions in Pakistan. We have killed everything that is worth thinking about. Our culture is that of willful rule. We don't want to make any serious changes. So in that milieu, my only question is, I'm very happy with the central bank law, but I'd like to see balance. Central bank law alone won't do it. Central bank already has enough power. It is 20 times the size of the Ministry of Finance. It is 20 times the size of the Ministry of Planning. Its budget is maybe 10 times the size of either of them or both of them combined. We need to build up our capacity, our agency everywhere. We need to build up a culture of observing law and this thing. Hamza's right. I sat through 2 or 3 of these monetary and fiscal board meetings. They were totally useless. The central bank came there with an attitude that we don't want to share anything with you. Ministry of Finance came there with an attitude that we rule everything, and there was no discussion at all. We just sat there like fools having tea. So I think, quite frankly, we really need to move on. Okay, I'm going to give the last word to 2 gentlemen who want to say something. Very quickly, we don't want to go on for long. It's already over time. Zafar Saab, who is Zafar Saab? Zafar's iPhone.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
You are. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Ji. Thank you, Nideem Saab. My name is Zafar Hayat. Or basically, I have quite a good experience at the central bank. And my PhD is all about monetary policy and inflation in Pakistan. So this is a brief introduction. I have a couple of comments. Both say, like, I mean, the questions raised are already very pertinent. But I want to reflect on 2 major dimensions. One is the price stability. So, I mean, this is coming through that, like, perhaps the concept of price stability is not very well understood. So just to put it in very simple words, low and stable inflation. It's not a rocket science. So it has 2 elements into it. The level should be low and there should be stability, meaning, in other words, that the volatility around the level of inflation should be lower, right? So whenever we attain this kind of like scenario with respect to inflation, simply that is price stability. Now the key question is, जो कि अहमद भी पूछ रहे थे मेरा ख्याल है, and what needs to be answered is, okay, what are the price stability consistent inflation rates in Pakistan, right? So I've done some research which is published there. I mean, just to share with you, does inflation rise stabilize real growth? Evidence from Pakistan. So this is published in Journal of Policy Modeling in 2018, and this explicitly, answers these questions empirically. Okay, so there is just to add on to the discussion. Inflation rates को हम 3 major categories के अंदर divide कर सकते हैं in Pakistan. One is desirable rate of inflation. Another category could be neutral rate of inflation. The third one is threshold, and whichever falls or lies beyond the threshold level is undesirable. So the research indicates that inflation in Pakistan from 1 to 3% is desirable. Now, what's the definition of the desirable? By desirable, the research means that the inflation in that range positively and significantly enhances real economic growth in the long term, right? So if we are after desirable inflation rates, then in Pakistan, then the answer is the rates that falls from 1 to 3%. Now, what is neutral inflation rate? In Pakistan, it is from 4 to 5% as per that research, which I've shared with you. So neutral inflation rate in Pakistan is from 4 to 5%. Now, what does that mean? That means that the effect of inflation from 4 to 5% on real growth is positive, but that is not statistically significant. Now, what is the threshold level of inflation? Threshold level of inflation is the level of inflation beyond which the inflation would start harming your real economic growth. So any inflation rate beyond the 5% level in Pakistan is undesirable, because the more you go beyond 5%, the more it hurts or undermines the real economic growth. So this is just a little bit on that front, which will help us specify a little bit if we want to define price stability in Pakistan, then what should be the inflation rate? The inflation rate should be the desirable one, like from 1% to 3%, because on one hand side, it allows you to significantly boost real economic growth in the long term. And on the other hand side, it does not hurt the poor. It does not hurt your other macroeconomic indicators. For example, financial stability is positively.
हमजा साहब इस पे बेस्ट ये है, मेरा ख्याल आप हमारे साथ एक वेबिनार करें इस पे, ताकि इस पे मजीद बात कर सके. बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग पेपर है. आई थिंक वी शुड हैव अ वेबिनार ऑन इट, एंड वी विल. ये इस तरह आपके रिजल्ट्स नहीं नजर आ रहे ठीक, ये मेरा ख्याल वेबिनार करते हैं. We'll do that.
Just one more dimension I want to add on. कि ठीक है, one is this debate कि क्या होना चाहिए, price stability, consistent inflation rates क्या होने चाहिए. Apart from the fact that there is no doubt that price stability should be the primary objective of the central bank, it should be clearly and explicitly made visible in the central bank statutes. इसके ऊपर कोई second opinion नहीं है, and I can defend it to whatever degree.
We'll talk about it.
एक comment. Second question is.
We'll have a webinar with you, inshallah.
Fine, just a final word. एक important question ये हो सकता है, if anybody would want to answer, कि यार headline inflation होना चाहिए फिर या core inflation होना चाहिए. So if you're very much interested, वो वाली debate छेड़ेंगे कि अच्छा यार whether
वो जब आपके साथ वेबिनार करेंगे तो इंशाल्लाह we'll take it up. ठीक है ना? We'll
चलें
definitely-
जी, thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much.
मोहम्मद हुसैन साहब कौन है जी, जल्दी से बोलें।
Hello, Assalamu alaikum.
जी, introduce yourself and speak.
जी, Hasnain again from the monetary management team. Actually, मुझे 3 छोटे-छोटे questions थे. First one regarding जो हमजा साहब ने कहा कि why every country जो भी है IMF प्रोग्राम से हम बाहर क्यों नहीं आ सके. Just my personal experience is this कि हमारे पास probably कोई ऐसा मॉडल है ही नहीं. जब IMF आता है, IMF for example मैं 2 एग्जांपल्स देता हूँ. जब 2018 में आए, they said कि जी एक exchange rate adjustment चाहिए. So as a result we had a very significant exchange rate adjustment. ठीक है, उसका क्या हुआ, उसके फिर सेकंड राउंड इफेक्ट्स आना शुरू हो गए. सेकंड राउंड इफेक्ट्स के बाद इन्फ्लेशन बढ़ गई तो आपको डिस्काउंट रेट बढ़ाना पड़ा, जिससे फिस्कल ब्लो आउट शुरू हो गया उसका. और इसकी एक सेकंड एग्जांपल ये है कि जैसे वो आए, उन्होंने कहा एनर्जी प्राइसेस बढ़ाएं. एनर्जी प्राइसेस उस वक्त हमारा सर्कुलर डेट था अबाउट व्हाट 800 और 500 बिलियन, और अब 2 years down the road now it has more than doubled despite के increasing prices. So maybe as a policy makers we don't have any models कि जिसमें हम IMF को counter कर सकें कि जो, because IMF comes with a very plain vanilla model, market based model. वो कहते हैं ये कर दें, प्राइसेस बढ़ा दें, मार्केट बेस पे ले आए. बट वी डोंट, बिकॉज डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज में मार्केट्स परफेक्ट नहीं होती. वी हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड कि हमारे यहाँ पे लो इनकम कंट्री है. एनर्जी फॉर एग्जांपल इज अ वेरी इनइलास्टिक कंपोनेंट ऑफ द डिमांड. सो जब आप प्राइस बढ़ाते हैं तो रेवेन्यू तो बढ़ता नहीं है, डिफॉल्ट्स बढ़ना शुरू हो जाते हैं, एनर्जी चोरी बढ़ना शुरू हो जाती है. उससे क्या होता है कि आपके रेवेन्यू तो वहीं पे वही रहता है, मगर आपका सर्कुलर डेट बढ़ना शुरू हो जाता है. Maybe we as a policy researchers we need to work out those models and probably argue with the IMF कि नहीं, जो आपका मॉडल है उसमें ये एडजस्टमेंट्स हमें करनी पड़ेंगी. जो आपका मॉडल है इस तरह नहीं चल सकता.
बिल्कुल सही.
और सेकंड थिंग रिगार्डिंग गवर्नमेंट बोरोइंग, अभी रिसेंटली अगर हम देखें तो बैंक्स की ओवरऑल लॉन्ग टर्म बोरोइंग क्यों नहीं करते, क्रेडिट क्यों नहीं करते, उसे एक बड़ी रीजन ये भी है कि इस वक्त बैंक्स का टोटल जो डिपॉजिट मिक्स है ऑन एवरेज 86% इज इन डिमांड डिपॉजिट्स. अगर हम BIF 5 पे चले जाए तो ये 92% हो जाता है. तो एक बैंक जिसके 92% डिपॉजिट ही करंट अकाउंट में पड़े होंगे, वो कैसे लॉन्ग टर्म में फंड करेगा. सो दैट्स अनदर प्रॉब्लम कि जिसके ऊपर हमें बात करनी चाहिए उसके साथ. एंड वी शुड नीड टू एक्चुअली एड्रेस दीस अंडरलाइंग्स.
बिल्कुल सही, थैंक यू वेरी मच. यही तो मैं रोता हूँ बार बार जो हमजा से मेरी डिबेट है कि एक तो हमारी तैयारी कोई नहीं होती, और IMF प्रोग्राम पिछले 30 साल से नहीं, IMF प्रोग्राम तो शुरू से हमारी हिस्ट्री में सारा वक्त IMF प्रोग्राम है. वी हैव डेलीगेटेड अ पॉलिसी मेकिंग टू IMF, हम खुद नहीं बनाते. नंबर 2 बात, ये फाइनेंशियल डेवलपमेंट की बात मैं तो कन्विंस नहीं हूँ. आई थिंक देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ वर्क इन फाइनेंशियल डेवलपमेंट दैट नीड्स टू बी डन. वी बिलीव इन फाइनेंशियल over regulation for financial stability. We don't believe in allowing something to grow. It's like a little child जिसको आप grow नहीं करने देते, आप उसको कहते हैं सेफ रहे कमरे में रहे, तो फिर बढ़ नहीं सकता. तो हमारा फाइनेंशियल सेक्टर की जो हम 92% की बात करें, ये I put it directly at the central bank's door. Why is it 92% demand deposit? Why we have cash economy so far, and why is the central bank relying on exchange controls? And I don't buy this fact that the central bank has always been dictating the exchange rate. There are periods when the central bank has been using the exchange rate as a nominal anchor. I would argue ये बात गलत है कि exchange rate के nominal anchor inflation था. No, exchange rate up till now has always been the nominal anchor. और ये central bank करता है, हम लोग नहीं करते. तो मेरा कहने का ये मतलब है, I'm not saying कि I'm right on anything, I'm right on nothing, but we must have a debate. The problem in Pakistan is the policymakers think they're above debate. They can do whatever they like. I think it would be nice if the policymakers sat down, like जो Aspen Institute में जाके वो बात करते हैं, क्या नाम है, पॉलिसी मेकर्स हमारे भी यहाँ करें ना, जरा बात करें, खुल के बात करें, आए बात करें, बात चीज़ें बनाएं. बट ये चीज़ है इंस्टीट्यूशनल ग्रेवयार्ड में एक इंस्टीट्यूशन की लॉ बनाने का कोई फायदा नहीं. थैंक यू वेरी मच folks. This has been a great discussion. Enjoyed it. All the best. Thank you, Janjua Saab. Good to see you again after a long time.
Thank you, sir.
Hamza will continue the discussion offline again and online too. Thanks. You've always been a great participant. Thank you, Ahmed.